There is a reason to fight.
I remember when I was in California, and I was there, and something just really horrific happened in our church back in California. I was in Mongolia at the time as a missionary and heard about everything that took place. And it was terrible, and heard a bunch of my friends that started going to this other church. But, I mean, this was a church of thousands that all of a sudden came to nothing. And it was just destroyed. And I was overseas with this ministry, and now all of a sudden back home, the whole foundation came out from underneath us, so to speak. And I remember coming back then to the States, and I started going to this other church. And I remember as I was there, something started happening to me, and I didn't know what was going on. I remember I got back, I went to Pennsylvania, then went back to California to this other church, and where a lot of my friends were going to. And I didn't get a job right away. I started volunteering and helping out. I would actually take a bus for 3 hours, one way, 3 hours. So literally I'd be on the bus 6 hours a day to go help volunteer for 8 hours. No money, right? Just volunteer. And my family members are, why aren't you getting a job? I don't know. I don't feel like I'm supposed to get a job right now. I'm supposed to do this. And then as I'm trying to do something good, as I'm trying to do what I sense is right, as I'm trying to sacrifice, all of a sudden something began happening to me, to my body, where I started to get real sick. And I started to lose my appetite. That was the first thing that began happening to me. I lost my appetite. I didn't have a hunger anymore. Now you would think at my weight and size, that's a good thing, right? And I think I took it like that for a while as well. In fact, after a while, I just thought it was bad gas. I had no idea what was happening. And I'm thinking, now this will come to pass. This will go away. And it didn't. It just kept persisting and persisting and persisting. And then I started getting pains. And my family members heard and saw me, and they took me to the hospital. They took me to this county hospital. And I say county hospital because county hospitals in America sometimes are not the best. And so I went to this county hospital in California. And as I was there, I found out that my appendix had ruptured, my appendicitis. Now, if you don't know exactly what that is, it's literally your appendix ruptures. And appendicitis happens when all of a sudden the poison that made your appendix begin flaring up and get inflamed, all of a sudden there's a rip in your appendix and the poison comes out of your body. And that poison, or out of the appendix, I should say. And it could kill you. And I thank God that it didn't. What happened, the poison came out, but somehow my body created, or God created, this encapsulating force where it was like a size of a grapefruit inside of me. And all the poison was encapsulated. Somehow my body quarantined it off, so to speak, inside of me. And as I was there in the hospital, I was going through fever. I had 104 fever at the time. I was hallucinating. And then they had to quarantine me off in my own isolation, my own room, by myself. And also at the same time, I'm having to pay for this, right? This is money that is very expensive. So then when they put you in your own room, it's even more expensive. Now, I didn't have any money at the time. Now, I'll jump to this one testimony real quick. Because I didn't have a job and I went to a county hospital, there was a $65,000 bill that was covered. Had I had a job, I would have had to pay for that. And I wouldn't have been able to get a job and get benefits in time for that thing that happened. So God directed me not to have a job at that time, and I thank God I didn't, because a $65,000 bill was covered because of that. Right? So that's that testimony. Now back to having to be quarantined. The reason I had to be quarantined is because there's part of that appendicitis that looks like something called TB. If you heard of TB, it's not something that is friendly or nice, and a lot of people are scared of it. And when I went to Africa, back to that story in Africa I was mentioning, we went into a TB ward and we were praying for people in there. And so I have to tell the hospital that, yes, I went to a place where there was TB. I never contracted it, never got it, right? But because there was a strain of appendicitis that looks like TB, they had to take precautions, and they quarantined me off. They actually went to my family's home and began quarantining my family's homes. And that, when I heard that, that hurt so much. I can only imagine some people right now that are dealing with COVID-19 and they've had to have their families quarantined off because of it. Or maybe you weren't exposed or didn't do anything or weren't around it, but someone else around you was, and now that affected you. Can I just tell you, that really hurts the person that they might have done that to you or brought that to you without knowing. And I remember being in that situation thinking, oh my gosh, my family has to be quarantined and now I'm quarantined and there's not much I could do and I'm feeling sick and out of it. And again, 104 fever, and I remember a nurse came in and had a mask on. This was in the middle of the night, and I began hallucinating with that fever. And I thought she was a gorilla coming to attack me, right? This big nurse coming, and I just started getting scared. I started shaking, thinking, oh my gosh, the gorilla's going to come kill me. And Thank God I was just a nurse trying to take care of me at that moment in time. But I remember a week into there, and things were painful. My whole abdomen was hurting and in pain. And I remember one night I was watching a TV. And as I was watching that TV, I remember looking up and seeing a show that was from a missionary journey, the same mission organization that I went to go to Africa. And I'm watching it on TV, and all of a sudden I'm remembering when I was 17 years old and I went into Africa and I saw that Roman Catholic priest and I saw these miracles. And all of a sudden something began stirring up inside of me. And at this moment in time, I'm in misery. I'm dealing with pain. My family's being quarantined. I'm alone. And it's not good. I'm having 104 fever. I think gorillas are attacking me in the middle of the hospital. I have people coming and poking me all over the place, and so miserable. And then I look up on the screen, all of a sudden hope began coming alive again. It was like my little burning bush experience. And I remember looking and tears coming as I remembered what God had done in and through my life before. And as I was looking on that screen, I remember telling God with tears in my eyes, God, I'm never going to give up. I'm never going to stop. I'm going to keep going. And I remember in that moment of time, I felt like I heard inside of me, I felt like I heard God say, that's what I was waiting for. And all of a sudden, in that moment of time, something began happening. It was like an internal earthquake almost, where this rumbling began happening. Usually that would hurt, but it didn't hurt. And I started groaning. It's almost like crying, this like uncontrollable crying that began happening. And I was like, oh, and I felt like at that moment, God was putting something in and taking something out. And I didn't quite understand. It was just a feeling. I could decipher the feeling of something being removed and something put back in. And at that moment in time, I knew a miracle took place. And I remember sitting up in my bed, and I didn't have the same pain anymore. And I knew that appendicitis, that poison was taken out, and that hope was revived inside of me. That love, when I told God, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep going. Against all odds, I didn't stop. I kept going. And all of a sudden I realized in that moment of time that a miracle took place. And sometimes we're waiting for the miracle to happen, but sometimes God's waiting for you to step into the miracle. Sometimes He's waiting for those words. Sometimes He's waiting for you to turn and say, God, here I am. God, I'm going to keep going. God, I'm here listening to what it is you have to say. God, speak to me. And so in that moment, I remember then the next day they tried to go down and drain the abscess that was there, and it was gone. They couldn't find it. And the head doctor, he didn't believe it, so he sent me back down. They did another x-ray. They couldn't find it. It was completely gone. I told the head doctor, I said, look, I believe there was people praying. I believe God did this. He kind of shook his head and said, that's the only explanation I could think of. And that was the head doctor saying that. Him shaking his head, couldn't think of another explanation at the time. And I still have never heard of another explanation. But I know it was God. I know what God did. And I know I was dealing with someone that might have had doubt. But I was able to tell them, look at what God did. And they had to say, yep, had to be God. Where a doctor was able to point towards God in that moment in time as well. And I remember that so vividly. That was a moment in my life where God did that miracle. It was profound. And here was the thing, that miracle, that moment of misery that turned into a testimony, began blessing other people, because I came back to our church and I was sharing this now with a bunch of my other friends that had left the other church. And I told them this testimony. I told them how I lost my appetite. And perhaps spiritually, many of them and many of us maybe lost our appetite for God. And we just didn't understand, why am I not hungry for this? I know I need to eat, but I'm not hungry. And as I began sharing a little more about some of the other symptoms and how they correlated with spiritual things, all of a sudden, at the end of the pastor's message that was there was a big altar call that came forward, and many people came back to Christ.